The conference hall in Geneva buzzed with quiet conversations as diplomats from around the world took their seats. Benjamin Netanyahu, the seasoned Israeli prime minister, adjusted his tie and reviewed his notes one final time. Across the room, Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young revolutionary leader, sat with the calm confidence of someone who had already faced down multiple coups and emerged victorious. The World Economic Forum had brought together leaders to discuss the future of global governance, but tensions were already brewing beneath the surface. Netanyahu represented the established order, a man who had navigated Middle Eastern politics for decades. Traoré embodied the new wave of African leadership, unafraid to challenge Western dominance and speak truth to power. As the morning session began, Netanyahu took the podium first. His speech was polished, diplomatic, yet firm. He spoke about security challenges, economic partnerships, and the need for stable alliances. But it was his closing remarks that would spark the confrontation everyone would remember. The future belongs to those who understand the realities of power, Netanyahu declared, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Some nations have proven their ability to lead, while others must learn to follow the established path to prosperity. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several African delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, understanding the implicit message. Traoré's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure, knowing his moment would come. The Israeli delegation nodded approvingly, believing their leader had struck the right tone of authority. They had no idea they had just lit a fuse that would explode across international headlines within hours. During the coffee break, whispers spread through the corridors. Journalists sensed something brewing as they watched Traoré huddled with other African leaders, their expressions serious and determined. The young Burkinabe captain had earned a reputation for speaking his mind, regardless of diplomatic protocol. Back in the hall, as delegates returned to their seats, the atmosphere felt different. There was an electric tension, as if everyone sensed that the afternoon session would be unlike any diplomatic gathering they had witnessed before. Traoré had spent his coffee break not in anger, but in careful thought. He understood that his response would be heard far beyond the walls of this Swiss conference center. Young Africans across the continent looked to him as a voice of their generation, someone unafraid to challenge the old ways of thinking. As the afternoon session was called to order, all eyes turned to the schedule. Traoré was listed as the next speaker. He rose from his seat with the measured pace of a man who had led soldiers into battle and transformed a nation's political landscape before his 30th birthday. The moderator introduced him with the standard diplomatic courtesy, but everyone in the room knew this would be no ordinary presentation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define how the new generation of African leaders viewed their place in the world order. Netanyahu watched from his seat, perhaps beginning to realize that his morning comments had not gone unnoticed. The young captain from Burkina Faso was about to deliver a response that would reverberate across continents and challenge everything the established powers thought they knew about the changing dynamics of international relations. Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the microphone with the steady gait of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The conference hall fell silent as delegates sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Unlike Netanyahu's polished presentation, Traoré carried no formal notes, speaking from the heart with the passion that had made him a hero to millions of young Africans. Distinguished delegates, he began, his voice clear and strong. I have listened with great interest to the previous speaker's vision of the future. However, I must respectfully but firmly disagree with the notion that the future belongs to any single group or ideology. The room's attention was completely focused now. Even the translators seemed to lean forward, understanding they were documenting, a moment that would be replayed countless times. The future does not belong to us, Traoré declared, his words cutting through the diplomatic niceties like a sword. It belongs to justice, to equality, and to the dreams of every child born in every corner of this world, regardless of their nationality, race, or the accidents of history that determined where they were born. Several delegates from developing nations began nodding, while others from more established powers shifted uncomfortably. Traoré was not just responding to Netanyahu. He was challenging the entire framework of international relations that had dominated global politics for decades. For too long, we have accepted a world order where some nations claim divine right to leadership, while others are expected to be grateful for whatever scraps fall from the table of global prosperity, he continued, his voice rising with controlled emotion. This is not the future any of us should accept. The Israeli delegation watched with growing concern. This was not the diplomatic pushback they had expected. Traoré was delivering a masterclass in revolutionary rhetoric, but with the measured tone of a statesman, making his message impossible to dismiss as mere populist anger. When I look at the youth of Burkina Faso, of Africa, of the global south, I see minds brilliant enough to solve the world's greatest challenges, hearts brave enough to fight for justice, and spirits strong enough to build a better tomorrow, Traoré proclaimed. These young people do not need anyone's permission to claim their place in shaping the future. The camera operators had stopped their routine panning and were now focused entirely on the young captain. Social media teams from news organizations were already preparing clips that they knew would go viral within hours. The future belongs to those who dare to imagine a world beyond the limitations imposed by yesterday's thinking, he said, his gaze briefly meeting Netanyahu's across the room. It belongs to those who refuse to accept that geography or history should determine destiny. African delegates were now openly applauding, breaking protocol, but expressing their enthusiasm for words they had longed to hear spoken on such a stage. The moderator made no attempt to restore order, recognizing that they were witnessing a defining moment in international diplomacy. Traoré's voice softened slightly, but his message remained razor-sharp. We do not seek to replace one form of dominance with another. We seek a future where partnerships are based on mutual respect, where development comes through cooperation rather than condescension, and where every nation, regardless of size or military might, has an equal voice in determining humanity's path forward. The speech was becoming more than just a response to Netanyahu's comments. It was becoming a manifesto for a new generation of leadership that refused to accept the world as it was handed to them. Every word was carefully chosen, but delivered with the fire of genuine conviction. As Traoré prepared to deliver his closing remarks, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone understood they were witnessing the emergence of a new voice. On the global stage, one that would not be silenced or managed by traditional diplomatic channels. Within minutes of Traoré's speech ending, the conference hall erupted into chaos. Delegates huddled in animated discussions, their voices creating a buzz that the moderator struggled to control. Some applauded openly, while others looked shocked at the diplomatic boldness they had just witnessed. The carefully orchestrated atmosphere of the international summit had been shattered by one young African leader's refusal to accept the status quo. Netanyahu remained in his seat, his expression unreadable as aides whispered urgently in his ear. The Israeli delegation had expected pushback, but nothing like this. Traoré had not simply disagreed with their leader's statement, he had challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which their foreign policy was built. Meanwhile, Traoré was surrounded by reporters as he left the podium. Questions came from all directions in multiple languages, but he maintained his composure, offering brief but powerful soundbites that journalists knew would dominate headlines for days to come. Captain Traoré, do you believe your comments will strain relations with Israel? One reporter asked. I believe honest dialogue strengthens all relationships, he replied calmly. If speaking truth creates tension, then perhaps it was tension that needed to exist. Back in the conference hall, the impact was immediate and visible. Delegates from across the global south were energized, many approaching each other to discuss what they had just heard. For years, they had attended these international forums feeling like junior partners in conversations dominated by more powerful nations. Traoré had given voice to their frustrations and aspirations. The social media explosion began almost instantly. Video clips of key moments from both speeches spread across platforms, but it was Traoré's response that captured global attention. The hashtag #UsFutureDoesn'tBelongToUs began trending worldwide, with young people across Africa, Asia, and Latin America sharing the message with pride and determination. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, crowds gathered around television, screens broadcasting the speech. University students cheered as their young leader articulated their hopes on the world stage. Similar scenes played out across the continent as word spread of the diplomatic confrontation. European diplomats found themselves in a difficult position. Many privately agreed with elements of Traoré's message, recognizing the need for more equitable international relations. However, they also understood the delicate balance required to maintain existing alliances while acknowledging legitimate grievances from developing nations. The American delegation watched these developments with particular interest. The United States had been working to strengthen ties with African nations, partly to counter growing Chinese influence on the continent. Traoré's speech complicated this effort by highlighting the condescending attitudes that many Africans felt characterized their relationships with Western powers. Chinese observers noted the speech with satisfaction, seeing an opportunity to position themselves as champions of the developing world against Western arrogance. However, they also recognized that Traoré's message of independence applied equally to all major powers, including Beijing's growing influence in Africa. As evening fell in Geneva, the full impact of the day's events began to emerge. News channels across the world were leading with coverage of the diplomatic clash, with political analysts debating its long-term implications for international relations. In Israel, initial reactions were mixed. Some commentators dismissed Traoré as an inexperienced leader seeking attention, while others recognized the skill with which he had articulated his position. The Israeli government found itself needing to respond carefully, balancing support for their prime minister while avoiding further escalation. African media was unanimously celebratory. Headlines across the continent proclaimed variations of "Our captain speaks truth to power" and "Africa finds its voice." For many, Traoré's words represented the confidence and dignity they wanted to see from their leaders on the international stage. The diplomatic aftershocks were just beginning, but one thing was already clear. The old rules of international discourse had been fundamentally challenged, and the global community would need to grapple with the questions Traoré had raised about power, respect, and the future of international cooperation. The real drama began after the cameras stopped rolling. In the luxury hotel suites scattered across Geneva, delegations worked frantically through the night to understand and respond to the seismic shift that had occurred during the afternoon session. The comfortable predictability of international diplomacy had been shattered, and everyone was scrambling to adapt. In Netanyahu's suite on the 20th floor, the atmosphere was tense. His senior advisors paced the room, phones pressed to their ears as they fielded calls from Jerusalem, Washington, and European capitals. The Prime Minister sat quietly, reviewing footage of Traoré's speech on his tablet, studying every gesture and inflection. "Sir, the Foreign Ministry wants to know how we should respond," his press secretary said, holding up her phone. "The international media is calling for a statement." Netanyahu looked up from the screen. "What exactly are they expecting us to say? That a military officer from one of the world's poorest countries somehow offended us? That would only make his point for him." 3 floors below, Traoré's much smaller delegation was experiencing a different kind of chaos. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the speech ended. Presidents from across Africa were calling to express their support, while international media outlets begged for exclusive interviews. His small team was overwhelmed by the global attention. "Captain, the President of Ghana wants to speak with you," his aide announced, holding up yet another phone. "And CNN is waiting in the lobby," added another team member. Traoré looked out. The window at the Swiss Alps, their snow-capped peaks glowing in the moonlight. He had spoken his truth, but he understood the weight of responsibility that came with his words. Millions of young Africans were now looking to him to back up his rhetoric with action. Meanwhile, in the hotel's diplomatic wing, emergency meetings were convening throughout the night. The African Union delegation had called an impromptu session to discuss how to capitalize on the momentum Traoré had created. Representatives from Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and other major African nations debated strategy until dawn. "This is our moment," declared the Nigerian foreign minister. "For too long, we've accepted being treated as junior partners in global affairs. Captain Traoré has shown us another way." The South African representative was more cautious. "We must be careful not to isolate ourselves from important partnerships. The world economy is interconnected. We cannot afford to burn bridges." "What bridges?" countered the Kenyan delegate. "The ones that lead only to dependency and condescension? Sometimes you must burn the old bridges to build new ones based on equality." In another part of the hotel, European Union officials were conducting their own crisis management session. The French delegation was particularly concerned, given their country's historical ties to Burkina Faso and the broader Sahel region. They understood that Traoré's message resonated far beyond diplomatic circles. "This is about more than one speech," observed the French foreign minister. "This represents a generational shift in how African leaders see their role in the world. We need to adapt our approach or risk losing influence across the continent." The British delegation focused on the implications for Commonwealth relations, while the Germans worried about the impact on development aid partnerships. Everyone recognized that business as usual was no longer an option. Back in his suite, Netanyahu finally made his decision about how to respond. Rather than issue a formal statement that might escalate tensions, he chose a more subtle approach. He would reach out privately to other Middle Eastern leaders, framing Traoré's comments as part of a broader challenge to regional stability. This strategy backfired almost immediately. Within hours, recordings of his private conversations leaked to Al Jazeera, revealing his attempts to portray the Burkinabe leader as a dangerous radical. The leaked audio only reinforced Traoré's narrative about established powers trying to silence independent voices. As dawn broke over Geneva, the night of frantic diplomacy had accomplished little beyond revealing the deep divisions that Traoré's speech had exposed. The comfortable fiction that international relations could continue unchanged in the face of rising global South assertiveness had been definitively shattered. The real work of rebuilding international dialogue on more equitable terms was only just beginning, and everyone involved knew that the easy certainties of the old world order were gone forever. 3 weeks after the Geneva confrontation, the ripple effects had transformed into massive waves across the African continent. What had begun as a diplomatic exchange between two leaders had evolved into a continental movement that surprised even Traoré himself. University campuses from Cairo to Cape Town buzzed with discussions about sovereignty, dignity, and Africa's place in the global order. In Lagos, Nigeria's commercial capital, the energy was electric. Students at the University of Lagos had organized what they called future dialogues, daily gatherings where young people debated economic independence, technological advancement, and political transformation. The conversations were no longer just about criticism of the existing order, but about concrete steps toward building alternatives. Amina, a 23-year-old economics student, stood before a crowd of her peers in the university's main amphitheater. "Captain Traoré showed us that we don't need permission to dream big," she declared to thunderous applause. but dreams without action remain just dreams. What are we going to do with this moment? The question reverberated across the continent. In Accra, young entrepreneurs were launching tech initiatives they called Dignity Ventures, focusing on solving African problems with African solutions. In Nairobi, university students were organizing exchange programs with other African countries, determined to know their continent better than they knew Europe or America. The movement wasn't limited to young people. Dr. Wangari Muta, a respected economist at the University of Nairobi, found herself reflecting on decades of development policies that had treated Africa as a recipient rather than a partner. Perhaps we needed someone like Captain Traoré to remind us that expertise and wisdom don't flow in only one direction, she told her graduate seminar. In Burkina Faso itself, the transformation was most visible. International media attention had brought both opportunities and challenges. Foreign investors who had never considered the landlocked Sahel nation were suddenly interested in meetings, while development organizations rushed to align their programs with Traoré's vision of dignified partnership. However, not everyone on the continent embraced the changes. In several African capitals, established leaders felt uncomfortable with the revolutionary rhetoric. They had built their careers on careful diplomacy and gradual reform, and Traoré's approach seemed to threaten the delicate relationships they had cultivated with international partners. President Kofi Mensah of a West African nation that depended heavily on European aid expressed his concerns during a private meeting with other regional leaders. "We must be careful not to bite the hand that feeds us," he warned. "Captain Traoré can afford to take risks because Burkina Faso has less to lose. Some of us have more complex considerations." This sentiment sparked fierce debate within the African Union itself. Younger diplomats and officials rallied behind Traoré's message, while more established figures worried about the practical implications of alienating traditional partners. The generational divide became impossible to ignore. The economic implications began manifesting quickly. Several African countries started exploring new trading relationships, particularly with each other. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which had struggled for momentum, suddenly found new champions who saw it as a path to the economic independence Traoré had articulated. South African business leader Thandiwe Nkomo announced a $500 million initiative to support intra-African trade, explicitly citing Traoré's Geneva speech as inspiration. "We have the resources, the talent, and the markets to trade with ourselves," she declared at the launch event in Johannesburg. "What we've lacked is the confidence to believe we deserve equal partnerships." The cultural impact was equally profound. African artists, writers, and intellectuals found themselves re-examining their relationships with international funding bodies and Western institutions. The prestigious Kane Prize for African Writing faced criticism for the first time, with some arguing that African literature didn't need validation from London-based organizations. Nollywood director Chika Okafor announced he was returning a fellowship from a European Film Institute, saying, "I want to tell African stories for African audiences first. The world can watch if they're interested, but we won't beg for their attention anymore." The momentum built steadily, but it also attracted scrutiny. International media began focusing intensely on every aspect of Traoré's leadership, searching for contradictions or failures that might undermine his message. Critics pointed to Burkina Faso's ongoing security challenges and economic limitations as evidence that revolutionary rhetoric couldn't solve practical problems. Yet the movement had taken on a life of its own, extending far beyond any single leader. In universities, businesses, and government offices across the continent, a new generation of Africans were asking fundamental questions about their relationships with the rest of the world and their expectations for themselves. The old assumptions about who led and who followed in international relations were crumbling, replaced by something more complex, more confident, and potentially more transformative than anyone had anticipated when Traoré first stepped up to that microphone in Geneva. 6 months after the Geneva confrontation, the world looked fundamentally different. The simple exchange between Netanyahu and Traoré had catalyzed changes that surprised diplomats, economists, and political scientists around the globe. What had begun as a moment of defiant rhetoric had evolved into a systematic restructuring of international relationships. The most visible change came in how international conferences were organized. The old model of major powers setting agendas while smaller nations listened politely had become impossible to maintain. When the United Nations convened its annual General Assembly, the format itself had been redesigned to ensure more equitable participation. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, acknowledging the new reality, opened the session with unprecedented remarks. The events in Geneva taught us that leadership in the 21st century cannot be based on the assumptions of the 20th. We must listen with equal attention to all voices, regardless of the size of the nation or the age of the speaker. Netanyahu, still Israel's prime minister, had adapted his approach significantly. Rather than the commanding tone that had characterized his Geneva remarks, he now spoke about partnerships and mutual respect. His advisors had spent months studying the diplomatic revolution that his comments had inadvertently triggered. "We have learned," he told the assembly, "that strength comes not from dominance, but from the ability to build genuine alliances based on shared interests and mutual dignity." The words were carefully chosen, representing a complete reversal from his original position. When Traoré took the podium at the same assembly, the hall was packed beyond capacity. His Geneva speech had made him one of the most sought-after voices in international affairs, but success had also brought new responsibilities and challenges. "The future we spoke of in Geneva is not a distant dream," he announced to the attentive audience. "It is being built every day by young people who refuse to accept limitations imposed by others' imaginations. It is being constructed by entrepreneurs who see opportunities where others see only problems, by students who ask new questions rather than accepting old answers." The concrete changes were remarkable. African countries had increased trade among themselves by 40% in just 6 months, largely driven by new initiatives inspired by the Geneva moment. The African Development Bank reported unprecedented interest in intracontinental projects, from technology hubs to transportation networks. The ripple effects extended far beyond Africa. In Latin America, young leaders began applying similar principles to their relationships with North American and European partners. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations saw a surge in independent initiatives, with member countries pursuing more assertive positions in international negotiations. Dr. Sarah Kim, a professor of international relations at Seoul National University, captured the broader transformation in her widely read analysis. The Geneva Exchange revealed a fundamental shift in global power dynamics that had been building for years. Traoré simply gave voice to aspirations that existed across the global South. The question was never whether change would come, but who would lead it. The personal relationship between Netanyahu and Traoré themselves evolved in unexpected ways. After months of indirect communication through diplomatic channels, they met privately during the UN gathering. The conversation, lasting over 2 hours, remained confidential, but both leaders emerged with what observers described as mutual respect. "We may disagree on many things," Netanyahu said afterward, "but I cannot question Captain Traoré's commitment to his people or his courage in expressing his convictions." Traoré's response was equally measured. "Experience teaches wisdom, and Prime Minister Netanyahu's experience offers valuable lessons, even when our conclusions differ." The economic implications continued to unfold throughout the year. Traditional aid relationships were being renegotiated to emphasize partnership rather than dependency. Development organizations found themselves adapting their approaches to accommodate the new expectations of dignity and equality that had spread across the developing world. However, the changes also brought new challenges. Some critics argued that the enthusiasm for independence sometimes overlooked practical realities of global interconnectedness. Others worried that the movement might lead to isolation rather than better integration. Traoré addressed these concerns during his final speech of the year at the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. Independence does not mean isolation. Dignity does not require arrogance. We seek to be partners, not followers. We offer friendship, not submission. The future belongs to all of us, but only if we build it together as equals. As the year ended, it was clear that the Geneva moment had become a watershed in international relations. The old certainties about who led and who followed had been permanently disrupted. A new generation of leaders was emerging across the global south, inspired by Traoré's example, but developing their own approaches to asserting their nation's dignity and independence. The young captain from Burkina Faso had spoken just a few minutes in Geneva, but his words had unlocked aspirations and possibilities that would reshape global politics for decades to come. The future, as he had declared, truly did not belong to any single group or ideology. It belonged to those brave enough to claim it with dignity, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to human equality.